A lot of journalists anticipate that at some point you'll see a national security prosecution of a journalist. Usually, I think not over necessarily publishing it per se, but over how they obtained the information in this administration. I think when you listen to how the Trump folks talk about the press, that seems like a reasonable prediction. It's something people are really worried about.
All right, we are back with my buddy Ben Smith. He is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Semaphore. He also co-hosts the Mixed Signals podcast. I was probably the best guest on that podcast so far. It's had a pretty good slate of guests, though. But, I make good pod. Ben, what do you think? Am I on the podium?
You or Anthony Fauci? The listeners are divided.
Yeah, me or Fauci. Fauci has a lot of skills that I don't have, like in a lot of experience that I don't have. But I think in the podcast space might be the one area where I have him, podcast and basketball. I want to this wasn't really the topic when we had initially planned to talk, but I had Jeff Goldberg on yesterday, and we were talking about what he should do.
I saw you're not his lawyer.
With the Houthi small group PC chat, but it was worth thinking about. And I think that the fact that he was weighing what to do was evidenced by the fact that he released the text about an hour ago this morning before we're taping. And you had kind of a similar kind of quandary where you were dealing with lawyers and national security officials and classified information when you're at BuzzFeed. You're running BuzzFeed, and you guys had the Steele dossier, and you ended up publishing it in its entirety. And so I'm wondering what, if you have any kind of insight on what Goldberg was going through and how you think they handled it.
Yeah, I think Jeffrey has a stronger impulse to take to defer to national security concerns than a lot of journalists do, actually. I don't think he had any obligation to keep those secrets, which had been texted to him, and he was sort of asking the Trump people, like, hey, are you really sure that you want me to release it? Because they were out there daring him to release it. There was but they basically put him in a position where they called him a liar and said the stuff wasn't real and wasn't secret. So at some point you gotta, they were really basically asking him to release it. And I think, the Steele dossier was different in that it was authentic, but we didn't know if it was true. So, and the challenge and the debate about releasing that was, what do you do with a document like that, where everybody's talking about it? It's being used by the government as kind of a public document, but it contains a bunch of unverified allegations. This one,
the call was easier for Jeff, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
because it's verified and true. We know it happened because the building collapsed in Yemen.
Yeah, and there is, and actually, I do think there's a reasonable question to ask often when kind of quote unquote national security secrets are declassified. National security officials warn of dire consequences, and then you do occasionally see really awful consequences, but more often you don't. I think WikiLeaks is a really interesting example where there was a lot of warnings about the terrible things that would happen when these cables leaked, and they were very disruptive and probably damaging to American power and prestige. But I'm not sure there was that there was the physical danger to people that a lot of people anticipated. So I don't know. In this case, this is very rare that you get something where, had it leaked, obviously the Houthis' friends would have told them, hey, get out of that building.
Right.
And I think it's not totally clear that didn't happen, right? The Houthis' friends, true. The Russians may have done that. We just don't know.
Right. And who knows, like what anti-aircraft, like it could have even been worse than that, like getting out of that building, I guess, conceivably. What about the legal aspect of this? Jeffrey, was asking me whether I was the right person to be giving him legal advice on whether or not that he should be releasing these texts.
Yeah, the main legal aspect is that no one should take your legal advice.
I agree. Nobody should take our legal advice. But you dealt with all these guys, all these lawyers. I'm just kind of wondering, give us a little insight into what those conversations were like. It is kind of unprecedented. Both of these situations, you talk to experts, but they're like, it's a judgment call.
The tradition in the United States, unlike most countries, is that journalists who have obtained this information are, in a legitimate way, have no legal restriction, no prior restraint, no legal restrictions against publishing. In Britain, for instance, the government will send out these notices to the press saying you cannot publish this. They can't do that here. And actually, I had an experience that I found somewhat inspiring back when I was at BuzzFeed, where we had a story that was where the CIA had a really legitimate concern. It was about a Russian defector, really legitimate concern that if we reported on a person's whereabouts, that would put them in physical danger. Yeah. And all Mike Pompeo could do was ask me and our investigations editor over for a cup of coffee and make the case to us. And that was it. And you're like, you know what? This is a pretty amazing country. We're the most powerful intelligence official in the world. All he can do is ask you politely. Like, that is a huge prerogative of the press, something that we do, I think, take pretty seriously. The Jeffrey takes, I think, extremely seriously. Yeah. But all that said, I do think there's always been an element of the government that feels that that's insane, that we should have something more like the European model where the government can just step in and censor the press. And I think that a lot of journalists anticipate that at some point you'll see a national security prosecution of a journalist. Usually, I think not over necessarily publishing it per se, but over how they obtained the information in this administration. I mean, I think when you listen to how the Trump folks talk about the press, I think that seems like a reasonable prediction. It's something people are really worried about.
Yeah. I mean, as Walter Sobchak said, the Supreme Court has roundly rejected prior restraint, but we've got a new Supreme Court now, so you do never know. I think that they might I think that when you looked at the discussion yesterday at the Senate Intel hearing, that was, horrible timing for Ratcliffe and Tulsi there yesterday. But they asked, the Democratic senators asked them point blank about this, and it was notable that they would not say that no, he would not be prosecuted for this. There was no defense of the free speech rights of Jeff Goldberg yesterday by the Trump administration, on this point. And so, who knows what
it's an unusual situation, right? Where you're handed a bunch of classified documents, and an unusual thing about the United States where you have no responsibility as a citizen to protect them, to be honest.
What a great country. You might say.
That's what I think.
Fist bump. Flag emoji, fire emoji to the USA right now. I do want to kind of transition this to what we were actually talking about, which is kind of how the media has changed in Trump 2.0 versus 1.0 and how it's matured. I'm wondering what your top kind of insights are.
I mean, honestly, I was thinking about that before coming on this show, and I was listening, as I often do in the morning, to Steve Bannon's War Room, which is where I heard you interview Goldberg. Was on Steve Bannon's War Room because I didn't catch the Bulwark yesterday, and
Bannon's a mutual fan of both of us. I had a lengthy tribute to your reporter Dave Weigel on a podcast a week or two ago that I was listening to at an airport. I told Weigel, I was like, you got a 12-minute ode to Dave Weigel of Semaphore on the Bannon War Room. It's an interesting.
Dave Weigel's a great reporter who saw a lot of this stuff coming. I mean, I think Bannon is alert to who sort of understood that populism was a real thing. Yeah. And he's very preoccupied with you. You'll be glad to know. I'm sure he'll pick this up and put it on his show. So we'll complete the circle. But I think what that is to say is that there is really, I think for all the years and years in our whole careers of talking about and being involved in a new media that was rising and changing things, it's here. And I think when you look at the conflict between the Trump and the White House press corps, I do think it's very important that the press sort of retain prerogatives and not hand control of facts over to people in power. That said, Trump is not the reason that the White House press corps and the White House Correspondents Association is in real trouble. It's because, it's the organization's been dominated for nearly a century by these broadcast outlets that are no longer all that relevant and are being replaced by a kind of chaotic new group of digital outlets. Trump may have sort of pulled the last brick out of the wall, but he's not the reason that there's a crisis there. The reason is this vast, rapid technological shift, and it feels like Trump was the thing that broke the dam, but he wasn't really the cause.
And it really is different than 2019 on this point. I've been using this analogy of I'm a 90s movies reference, elder millennial now, obviously. So on Men in Black, remember how Tommy Lee Jones said the real news was the tabloids?
Yep.
That is kind of true. Obviously our friends Maggie and John Swan and Caputo, they're the traditional outlets are getting scoops. But there are times when you're either listening to Bannon, or I was watching the Newsmax interview last night and Greg Kelly would say something about something that he's hearing, and you're like, it's kind of true, right? At some level that there are certain things that are known and covered in the MAGA media sphere that are a more accurate view of what is happening in the administration than what you see elsewhere, or at least a more influential one. I don't know.
Yeah, right. No, I think that's right. That's who they're talking to, and that's what they're watching. I would say, and that's a source of strength for them. It does it's also extremely dangerous for them, I think, in a moment, when they're in this early, they're on this high, they're, you know, in a bubble of self-congratulation. And obviously there's a risk when you do that and you don't,
you see it in this
you
story.
don't take any signal. And I think on this story in particular,
the ridiculous Mike Waltz defense that maybe Jeff Goldberg hacked the chain. Like, it's just, if you would probably have a better spin if you felt like you had a more challenging counterparty.
Yeah, and the coverage in the sort of MAGA sphere tends to be like the White House is fighting back against this media campaign, in the Democrats, and that's all true. But also, like, well, what happened factually? What's going on here gets a little swept away.
Yeah, you were asking Megyn Kelly about this, and I recommend people watch your interview at it was the Semaphore Conference.
Our media summit.
Yeah, you had a media summit with Megyn Kelly, and at some level, there were points of the interview where you seemed a little scared of her, like you were kind of interviewing, like you were like on this, like you're walking down the street and there's somebody that's like drunk and carrying a knife and starts yelling at you, and you're just kind of like, whoa, okay, whatever you want, but okay. Like
I would not compare
unhinged.
her. I don't think she was unhinged.
Maybe not unhinged.
She's one of a handful of like people who
unpredictable, maybe,
are extremely capable, sort of like broadcasters who are good at owning people who cross them on air. And I didn't feel that I was necessarily going to win like a shouting match with Megyn Kelly.
I agree with you. She was not unhinged. I want to correct that.
She was hinged.
She was hinged, but
she could have gone anywhere.
She could have. She was going to say what she was going to say, and she could have gone anywhere. And it's not like a typical restrained interview. She was unrestrained, maybe.
Yeah, I mean that's her brand and her strength, I would say.
But the interesting thing about the interview, though, is she's obviously obsessed with her numbers and all this. But she's like, her show alone is getting CNN level numbers on YouTube. Like it's even like everything on the CNN network combined. Is like, and so, when we talk about the new, again, that is a development from Trump 1.0. And it really was just Fox, it was just Fox. And then there are these other little outlets that serve like the MAGA sickos, they're like very online MAGA people, right? But like now it's changed. The power dynamic has changed.
Yeah, Megyn Kelly, Tucker, Bannon's War Room drives like phone calls and book sales, like whatever, like digital media metrics are all kind of nonsense notoriously, but there are these sort of real metrics, like can you light up the switchboard? Can you sell books?
Right.
And that's, those are that now increasingly shows, I would say, like this one, and diminishingly, television, broadcast television, I would say, with the exception of Fox, actually.
And Nicole. We're selling books on this podcast. That's why Andy's going to be on next.
Buy Andy's book.
Both of us have gone, have gone way back with Breitbart, as you mentioned earlier, with Bannon back when he was at Breitbart. You wrote for Semaphore about kind of the challenges about this, like the growing up, the coming into adulthood of MAGA media, where it's like you can become establishment MAGA, where you have like responsibilities and you're getting outflanked by the people that are using the tactics that you'd use to succeed. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I spent a bunch of time with Matt Boyle, who's Breitbart's Washington bureau chief of longstanding, and a bit with John Carney, who's their finance writer. And Carney was saying to me, I sort of realized if I tweet like tariffs are coming, the market's going to dip 100 points, and so it's like this weight of responsibility that I did not previously have. And I think, and Boyle, I think, is constantly a situation where, Breitbart's readers and fans are saying, hey, I saw this thing on X that is totally made up. Can you confirm it?
Yeah.
And then annoyed at them and disappointed when they can't confirm it. I saw them running AP fact checks on USAID the other day, on Breitbart.com. And I think, on one, I would say they are still fundamentally committed to supporting Donald Trump, and occasionally perhaps holding him accountable to being the best version of Donald Trump. But I think I do. I mean, maybe they're in their adolescence. I think there is some world where these outlets are sort of forced by reality to, and by the fact that actually Breitbart, which is kind of an attack machine and very aggressively partisan, does try to get facts right. And I think that's being forced to get facts right. Unlike, which is just not true on X. On X, like the best way to monetize your account is to make things up and get them retweeted. Like facts do have a certain kind of gravity, and you can imagine an evolution toward a kind of partisan, but like British style partisan media. Don't think that's where we are right now.
Yeah, no, well, we're seeing it, and it's the danger. I think this is a big warning sign for the left right now. Look, I have a lot of criticisms for you and your pals in the mainstream media's treatment of Trump. Yeah, the normalization, the both sides. I'm sympathetic to all of the criticism. So the criticism, it's tough. I think it's a big challenge covering him. Like when somebody's like constantly lying, it presents a new challenge from covering politicians that like lie occasionally. But I think the Democratic, there's a be careful what you wish for with the Democratic base, which we saw after the Biden debate, which is like that there is now an emerging kind of left-wing media ecosystem that also where you also can do pretty well by not telling the truth.
Oh,
and that's
totally
true in the influencer space and in the YouTube space where it's like, I remember after the Biden debate, remember he does that press conference on foreign policy, and I was turning on to one of the fellow, I'll just say it, I was turning on to Midas Touch to see how they were covering it over on YouTube, and they were like, this was the greatest demonstration of knowledge and skill that we've ever seen by a president in a foreign policy press conference. And those guys are succeeding.
You're going to get outflanked.
Gets us to a danger. Well, I'm not worried about getting outflanked. I'm saying it takes us to a dangerous place where you got to be careful what you wish for on what replaces the existing incumbents. And Breitbart's seeing it, and I think that on the left you might see it too.
Yeah, I mean, I think to put a point on it in a way, and this is I'm stealing an idea from my colleague Max Tani, but I think that there was a belief among Democrats that like the New York Times was Democrats' partisan outlet. Like you rely on the New York Times, and what the New York Times is going to do is expose what Trump is doing and write factually about it, with perhaps its heart beating on the left, but basically with the facts, and that will then. People will see that and they'll change their minds and they'll vote him out. And I think there's a sense now on the left, well, that didn't work, and so what we need are hyper-partisan shows that create create a bubble in the way that the right has created a bubble. And I think that's in some way what's driving this growth of this booming new hyper-partisan left-wing sphere that's going to turn you into the New York Times and turn the New York Times into the Wall Street Journal, where Annie used to work, and now is going to be stuck again.
All right, we'll see. We'll see what Annie has to say about all this up next. Thank you, Ben Smith. Come back soon.
Good to see you.